studied traditional Japanese art at the Nagoya University of Art in Japan and mastered, from what I can work out, Japanese to level 3, whatever that means. I mean, that's no mean feat. She has taught Japanese history and Western art history at the Richmond International University in London and at Huron University, USA in London. Suzanne lectures at universities, at NATFAS, and at museums. She has also contributed to the Asian arts courses for SOAS, London University, which is a very prestigious part of the university, as well as the V&A and the British Museum. Suzanne founded Japan Interlink to promote educational and cultural exchanges between Japan and the United Kingdom, and has led several study tours to Japan and to China. So please welcome Suzanne.
Thank you, Madi. Good afternoon. Very nice to be in Cape Town. It was snowing when I left London on Friday, so very glad to be here. Can you all hear me at the back? Is that okay? If at any point you can't hear me, then please do say so. Do speak up. This course is an introduction loosely called Japanism to Modernism. Though I thought it would be good to try to trace the threads between Orientalism, Chinoiserie, and Japonism, because they're all quite different and they have different trends and different outcomes. So I thought it would be good to spend the first session today in just looking at these three particularly different strands before we focus exclusively on Japanese art and Japanism, which are two different strands of the same thing. So we will start. Now, you should have a couple of sheets. There is another sheet to come, which is a book list, but we might get that tomorrow. I have seen it. It is here somewhere, but it just hasn't come down here yet. So we might get that tomorrow. But essentially, you should have two double-sided pages to begin. So modern Orientalism in the modern age, the current age, really starts here with the Description de l'Égypte. This was based on the expeditions of Napoleon's expeditions into Egypt between 1798 and 1802. Now, militarily, he was trying to secure the Mediterranean region for France and to colonize it, and was seeking to free, in inverted commas, the Egyptians from the Mamelukes, the Ottoman Mamelukes, that were making incursions into that region. And he thought to exert control over the Mediterranean in that sector and create more of a French empire. However, militarily and politically, his campaign was pretty much disastrous. However, it did give rise to a huge cultural explosion. It created, in a sense, the birth of Egyptology and archaeology, the first translation of hieroglyphs from the Rosetta Stone, which of course was first found by the French quarter, and then they had to hand it over when they had to submit to the British, the English rather. It also influenced the decision to build the Suez Canal. It triggered all subsequent excavations, including Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1923. It aroused interest in the ancient world again, and archaeological research for museums, antiquities, collectors, and the citizens of the world. So although politically it was not a good campaign, culturally, actually, it was the spur and the impetus for many things. The reason for all this cultural spur was that accompanying the elite French forces, the French army, were 500 civilians, of which 167 were scholars, mathematicians, engineers, artists, and draftsmen. And they mapped and measured and recorded and drew exactly what they saw, from the largest monoliths to the tiniest figures and decorations on the wonderful remains of the Egyptian culture that were there at the time. A commission of science and art and an Egyptian institute were founded because of this work. It was a huge work, a huge undertaking, quite extraordinary and without precedent for an army to have this number of civilians doing this work. So, as a result of this, in 1802, Napoleon ordered the imperial press to begin publication of the Description d'Egypte, and it had over 400 copperplate engravers who made over 3,000 illustrations in minute and beautiful detail of the temples of Luxor, the sphinxes. The Sphinx was up to here with sand. A lot of places had a lot of sand encroaching on them. That was cleared later on. And out of this huge document, it was divided into 3 sections, one for antiquities, one for the modern state as it was then, and the natural history of flora and fauna. So this meant that they catalogued the world's greatest museum at the time that they were there. And from this came many, many things. So we have here the frontispiece and the title plate of the Description d'Egypte, ordered by Napoleon from the imperial printers, and it shows us also the aspects of Alexandria and Philae that were recorded at the time. So the detail, we could spend a month just talking about this one document alone. It is so huge and very richly done. So this is really the start of the inquiry into things Oriental, which began really in the 18th and 19th centuries, and there were reasons for this. So going on a little bit further, we have the Illustrated London News, which was a wonderful publication, and they recorded many expeditions and worldwide sites for people who, of course, at that time didn't travel very much. So this is May 1851 with the opening of the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace. And at that time, between 1851, 1854, 1858, there were a whole series of great exhibitions, cultural exhibitions and expos in London and Paris and a bit later in New York. And you can see here the Illustrated London News is promoting this big exhibition in 3 languages, and there's a group of Chinese people in the middle here with their cues at the back. So there was great excitement on the Strand at the opening of this exhibition. Now, the Illustrated London News was a great publication which gave people these kinds of informations, and it was really a kind of amalgam of what we would say is National Geographic, the Cape Times, and Punch rolled together. So it was, it had its amusing things as well. However, it gave wonderful scenes like this. They sent out their correspondents to draw and made engravings from these exotic places. So the Saracen Gate south of Carthage, 1858. These kinds of scenes would be notable. Here we have a lovely one of the pyramids from the Boulac Road, 1874. Very visible in the sunset, very evocative, and also very beautifully drawn and engraved as well. And also, gave rise to some quite amusing aspects as well. So after Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, tourism went up by about 50% in Egypt in the subsequent years. So they've done these rather amusing sights of tourists. She's chasing chasing one of the little Arab boys, Egyptian boy down here, and the mother is there sort of chatting away. These are the tourists, and she's laughing, and he's desperately trying to get away from her, little brown babies, things like that. And you have other scenes like this. You want to photograph me? It's 2p. I'm sure we've all had that in various places that we've visited, and other amusing scenes with the rather hapless tourists going to Egypt in the early 20th century. but it gave rise to a kind of mania for all things Egyptian, including this rather lovely engraving of the design for the Egyptian house. It was called that, but it was actually originally put as the London Museum. It was in Penzance, but they had a collection which subsequently moved to the British Museum and was included in their collection. So it's slightly different. The house is still there extraordinarily, and it is a wonderful example of sort of over-the-top Egyptomania, which was one of the phrases that came to mind at the time. Also, even earlier, 1769, we have this extraordinary chimney piece designed in the Egyptian style by Piranesi. And really, it's an amalgam of styles which was just really over the top. They didn't really know what the hieroglyphs were. They were just copying them and putting them all together as a form of exoticism. And that is what was coming about with all these exhibitions and expos. It was to do with the expeditions and also colonialization from the British and the French as well in these regions, and bringing back items into Britain and England and France from faraway places. So at the 1854 Crystal Palace Great Exhibition, we had the Egyptian Court, which was designed by Owen Jones as a sort of replica of Luxor in London, as you can see. In fact, at Luxor, they have a whole row of rams, if you've ever been there, Ram Avenue. But here they decided rams were perhaps not appropriate, so put lions in their place. But also Owen Jones began this whole series of the grammar of ornament. And as you can see, a lot these capitals of these vast pillars here, and also in Egypt itself, they're all slightly different. They're all different. So having taken the drawings from Description de l'Egypte and then put them together with all the colorations as well, he devised this grammar of ornament for Egypt, and subsequently there was a grammar of ornament in Chinese pattern, Indian pattern, and subsequently a whole series came out of this. And this was for artists and designers to be able to use and distinguish these wonderful patterns that were coming back from exotic places and to use them in their designs. So this was the start of all this interest in these very exotic things. So Egyptomania took many forms. We have these two wooden and gilded sphinxes that were actually made in Spain, and a couple of rosewood and marble-topped wooden cabinets, very beautiful actually, with an inlay. And you can see there are two Egyptian ladies here standing, you know, with the sort of wings that they had sort of folded rather nicely in the front. So very beautiful and very elegant. So all the kind of trimmings that you would expect to find in these beautiful places. Sèvres also created a whole Egyptian service of porcelain. This particular one has the colossi statues of Amenoph III, and there were major other sites that were depicted from engravings in the center of these beautiful plates. Interesting, those colossi, I went a few years ago to Egypt. There's not as much of them left as there is in this particular engraving, so they've unfortunately become quite distressed, and there's less of them now than there was at the time. This beautiful jewel brooch is in the Victoria and Albert Museum collection, perhaps based on Nefertari and the beautiful designs they had in Egypt with precious stones. So from large to small, Egyptomania was really becoming a great movement as part of Orientalism. Now, the thing about Orientalism is that it is a catch-all phrase, Oriental. It comes, of course, from Oriental and Occidental, Occidental meaning from the West, Oriental meaning the East. But it's a non-specific area. It essentially means pretty much anything beyond the eastern end of the Mediterranean and the south. So it is not a specific place, it's an idea, and it's a concept, and it's a construction by the Western colonialists to interpret and to use the ideas from the East, wherever that happens to be. So there was another phrase, another word called the Levant, and that was, again, another sort of conjured up exotic places. The Levant is a sort of region in pretty much the Middle East. Levant comes from the French lever, to rise, so where the sun rose in the east, anywhere over there was the Levant, right? So it's an idea, it's a concept, it's not actually a specific place. Even the word exoticism, it's a late 16th century word via Latin from the Greek exotikos, which means foreign. Exo is outside, so exotikos, something outside, not of us. And it makes that distinction between us and other. And of course, Edward Said wrote extensively about this concept in his wonderful work, Orientalism. Not me, I hope. That's not me, is it? Let's carry on from it. Edward Said wrote about his view of what Orientalism actually meant. And of course, it is a word that comes out of Western tradition and Western colonialization to picture the other as an outside thing. And he talked very effectively about the way we view other cultures. And he talked about that idea and concept as if looking through a filter, looking through a lens of which we then view the other. So for a Western culture, we view the Orient or the Levant in the eastern parts as opposed to where we are, we being white Western colonial culture. So it's like looking through a prism, it's like looking through a other. But the interesting thing is that this works both ways, because the peoples of the other also look at us as exotic. To the Chinese and the Japanese, Buddhism was an exotic Western religion because it came from India, which is in the west of China and Japan. So to them, the West was exotic and different. So it depends where you are on the scale of, say, the Silk Road, which of course was well traveled before this time, as to what your concept of exotic is, what is foreign, what is other than you. So this is getting to be rather complicated. So we have to think of this exoticism as the encapsulation of another culture's way of going on that we perceive and we construct. It's not maybe actually who they are or what they do, it's our idea of what they do and who they are. And this is at the crux of this kind of us and them, the other, which is about Orientalism. As I say, Orient is the East, but it's a non-specific place, so it's a catch-all phrase. And the rather sad thing about Orientalism, the word Orientalism, that it's now actually become a derogatory term. In fact, with today's levels of political correctness, it's actually deemed an offensive term, which is rather sad. But to say something is Oriental means, oh, well, you're not being specific, you're just grouping a whole bunch of people and countries together and calling them that, a bit like a zoological term. So it's not actually giving precedence to those different cultures. So it's frowned upon. So unfortunately, London University, the School of Oriental and African Studies, has not yet changed its title, but they may well have to in the light of this new, different way of thinking. So this is some of the aspects of Oriental culture as perceived by the West. And again, the Illustrated London News shows us these exotic places. William Carpenter was one of their correspondents who went and drew various interesting places, and then they came back and made engravings. 1858, Shah Hamadan's Mujid gathering in there. And again, one has to remember that people did not travel widely in those days, so they would never have seen something like this other than reading it in the Illustrated London News, or as we do now, looking at that we would like to go to on our list. Caravanserai is a good example of this. So artists and writers and those of the educated elite would then do the grand tour. So the grand tour was a way of extending one's worldly knowledge and expanding one's education. And of course this was tied in with the colonial cultures of the time, of the 18th and 19th century. So in order to be a man of the world, and it was mostly men who did the traveling, but some women did as well, this was to amplify your knowledge of the world and go and find out what the other was doing and what they were like. So there is a whole wealth of these kind of images and paintings. This is quite an early one, 16th century, interior of a school in Cairo, nicely painted by Jacques de la Moine de Morgue, with the light coming in, filtered in through these lattice windows. So we have many of these kind of images, many different kinds of artists. French artist, famously, Gérôme, paints the snake charmer. And usually there is some sort of erotic content in this. There wasn't really in the school, but in this one there certainly is. Of course, the boy snake charmer is naked and is being viewed by a group of men sitting down watching him do the snakes. So there is this kind of frisson, which is something that would not be painted in our own culture, in our own Western culture. But because it's the other culture, they can then paint that and get away with it. Delacroix famously painted the women of Algiers in their apartments as waiting around, beautifully dressed or half-dressed, usually with a black maid as well, usually in the corner, sorry. And these are very well-known paintings of the kind of harem, which was a great subject for the artists of the time, but also pottery sellers, people in the street, carpet sellers, and the general scenes that they would have encountered on their grand tour. So all this became very familiar as exoticism, exotic, other, foreign, out there, not of us. So we have to kind of keep that concept in mind. It's their interpretation of these peoples and what they saw and how they painted them. These kind of images. Also, Jean-Étienne Lyotard, beautiful artist, beautiful French artist, painted meticulously. He was very good at pastels, oil pastels, but this is an oil painting of this lady in Turkish attire reading a book. So the kind of languid lady at ease, reading or not, was a popular subject, reclining ladies. He also painted these as well as part of his exoticness, this otherness. And this wonderful little painting here, Laura Tarsi, it's a watercolor painting on ivory. It is 3 inches by 3 3/4 inches. It's about that big. It is a tiny, beautiful little miniature painting with all the detail of this highly exotic Turkish dress on this woman. It is quite the most remarkable painting. There was an exhibition of his in the Royal Academy about a year or two ago. And he paints this lady here, Turkish woman with the high shoes. You can see that's quite exotic and beautiful. This is a slave girl, so she's not mentioned in the title. She's just a Turkish woman and her slave, you know, the secondary slave girl. But he painted it meticulously with great attention to detail. Of course, the most famous is this one by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, 1814, La Grande Odalisque. Now, somebody said, what is an odalisque? Well, an odalisque is a female slave, usually. It's an archaic term, or a concubine in a harem. Notably, an exotic, foreign, other, sexually attractive woman. It's a French term, 17th century, from the original Turkish odalik, oda, chamber, lik, meaning function in the chamber, in the bedchamber. So in the harem. The reason this was a very controversial painting at the time, I mean, it is beautifully painted, and of course Ingres is the great master of painting flesh. Beautiful, smooth, unblemished, the long back, the sinuous back, perfect, absolutely perfect. His technique was superb. But the thing is, she's looking at us, or just slightly beyond us. And it's okay to paint this because odalisque means she's a slave. The other, an exotic woman from a different place, put her in a turban, give her a bangle or two and an exotic fan, and it's okay, it's quite acceptable. She's not one of us, all right? She's one of them. So it's okay to paint her like this. And this is the whole frisson about the idea of the female slave being in captivity. And Ingres goes on to paint Le Bain Turc, the Turkish bath, which gives license to have a whole host of beautiful women naked in the bath. The Japanese also painted bath scenes, but not like this. They were quite different. And lots of other painters painted, especially white females. They are never colored or dark. Only the assistants, and the lady here is dark-skinned. They're all very, very pale-skinned, of course. This is part of that frisson, isn't it? And even Pièce très commune paints this harem of quite wild abandon of ladies in various stages of undress and riding a hobby horse, and there's men there, and they're all cavorting around, having a great time. But the idea was of this exotic other having this harem of women, captive women, obviously for the pleasure of men at any time of the day or night, just waiting to serve, as it were. So this, again, is a Western construct that became extremely popular. And into the 20th century, we have Henri Matisse with his famous series of odalisques as well. And this is quite also provocative, as this lady here is looking, of course, straight at us or at the artist in a very specific way. And the strong colours, the patterns that he used around here, and a bit later with the purple robe, dressing up his ladies in quite wonderful fabrics from all over the world. He travelled in Morocco, he brought fabrics back, and then he would dress a setting and put the model in it to paint the model with all the accessories around. So this, and we will talk a bit more about this style of painting a bit later on. So this was the idea, to go on the grand tour, to have your education, to go and travel to these places, learn about other cultures, exotic cultures, and to maybe bring back these wonderful exotic forms. So Lord Leighton, Frederick Leighton, in fact, he was only made a lord in the last year of his life. He was Fred Leighton for most of his life, but he was a fine painter. And his house in Holland Park in London is also a very fine house, as we can see here from the front. The rear of the house, the rear elevation, is not so interesting and not particularly planned or designed. This is the studio window up here. And actually, he did absolutely nothing with the garden at all. It's just a sort of wild bit of grass and bushes and a few bits and pieces. But over there, right over there in the corner, a very insignificant corner, there is a little pool like this, a little tiny pool with a fountain, except the fountain wasn't working that day. And there is a counterpart, the same pool, there are two of them, one outdoors and one indoors. So this one is just kind of at the side, not really a central piece at all. But this one here is the centerpiece of the Arab Hall. Now, the Arab Hall is quite a fabulous construction, and it really is a construction of Lord Leighton's idea of the exotic Orient. And it served two purposes. This is on the ground floor. And it was for entertainment. It was for entertaining his guests and his friends, and it was also to display his quite extensive collection of ceramics and tiles and objects found on his exotic excursions in the Middle East. So he really went to town on this, and it is a very beautiful and beautifully constructed and designed interior. So we have the lattice windows that you find in Morocco, and in the light filtering through in that painting of the school, the early one that we saw. And all these tiles, a lot of them came actually from Damascus. Now I'm going to compare his style with what he absorbed from other places. So this is, if anybody's been to Istanbul, sure you have, the Blue Mosque and its beautiful domes. Every area is patterned and domed and tiled with clerestory windows letting the light in. So he took this. Now this is the wonderful dome in the Hagia Sophia. And it's always under construction. There is always scaffolding going on in the Hagia Sophia, so one can't get past that, I'm afraid. But of course, this quite extraordinary dome is huge, and Lord Leighton's is somewhat smaller, but small but perfectly formed, we could say. So it has all the attributes. It also has a beautiful chandelier hanging from the middle of it. And the attention to detail, really, in Lord Leighton's extravaganza is quite extraordinary. So this is all on the ground floor. So coming away from the Arab Hall, which is a large room at the end, we come through the Narcissus Hall. Narcissus is the name of the bronze statue, which is in the middle here. And there are tiles by William de Morgan all around, and here he is displaying some of his beautiful pottery, blue and white, and Turkish pots and plates and things as we go. So if you're looking at something like the Ottoman culture and Turkish culture, particularly to do with tiles, Topkapi Palace, of course, is one of the best places to go. And in the audience hall here, 15th, 16th century, every surface is coloured and patterned and tiled and gilded and worked on. Really quite over the top comes to mind, but it is very beautiful. And he replicated that excess of pattern and ideas in his own Arab hall to entertain his guests. And if we look up, this is actually a stained glass window, very beautifully done, like little jewels of colour, like you get in the Ottoman palaces. And if we look, we've got the tiles here, we've got painted cornice up here in the arch, we've got griffins, we've got snakes and black eagles, we've got peacocks. I mean, all manner of fabulous creature is depicted in the mosaics around in the upper section of this. A huge amount of detail has been adhered to. And in the Topkapi Palace, we have these huge Quranic inscriptions going right around the upper part of the walls of these places, usually in blue and white, and these niches, which are put, you can see it's a harem. This is part of the harem, all right, we're back in the harem. And he replicated this exactly with his niches and his pots and the different sort of tiles that he used, almost like porphyry columns up here in the Narcissus Hall. I mean, it's an explosion of colour and pattern, which is really quite extraordinary. So these are some of the jewel-like windows in the Topkapi in the harem area with another dome up there, lots of those, and different styles all put together here. These are marble slabs, and this kind of huge wall, which is leading us up the staircase as a display cabinet here, shows you how he used the things that he actually brought back to show his wealth, his knowledge, the way of display. We all like to display our items if we buy things, but this is almost kind of an extravaganza in excess. He actually, I'll just finish with this one here, he even put him in a little viewing gallery, which in a proper mosque would be for the women to separate them, all right, up there, not part of the men's, down below. And he even has one of those little galleries, Quranic verse underneath, in one section of the Arab Hall, in the same way that the sultans in the Hagia Sophia had their own separate access for their prayers that overlooked the mihrab down below when the imam was giving the service in the Hagia Sophia. So they could listen and see, but not be seen to have that. So he even had that detail. It has to be said, Lord Leighton was not married. He didn't have a wife to tell him what he could and couldn't do. He didn't pay any attention to the garden out the back, as we've seen, whereas in a normal, formal aristocratic house, they would have probably had formal gardens with fountains and nice places to walk outside. He wasn't interested in any of that whatsoever. His sole concentration was on this wonderfully exotic, oriental, other interior. So this is what is the kind of ideas about the construction from a Western mind as to how the Oriental looks. But he did really quite a good job, I think. He was quite accurate. So Orientalism is then this amorphous place to do with other culture, exotic culture, foreign culture. And so too with China. China is also in the East, as we know. It's also other and it's also foreign, but it has a slightly different character to it. So back to the Illustrated London News to get our images of China. This one is, they call this a Chinese fruit girl. She looks more Cornish to my mind than Chinese. I mean, you can almost see she's got rosy cheeks and bearing a leg and boats in there, but you could see her in a Cornish village, couldn't you, really? But anyway, they depicted her, and there were stories, and their correspondent went to an actual consecration of a Buddhist abbot at Honam Temple, which was written about in great detail as to what they did and how they conducted themselves, and they were invited in, and he made this very fine engraving. And of course, they were always fascinated with the opium smokers as part of that rather exotic and indulgent culture. Of course, they never really admitted that it was the British, of course, who took opium to China and then kind of enslaved them to opium. The Opium Wars were about the 1840s on two occasions, 1840, 42. So really, that was a fairly awful part of our trading history. In order to gain the trade, we sell them opium to get tea at a cheaper price. So, but nevertheless, it was a source of fascination because it was other. So chinoiserie, chinoise is of course a French word from the French, meaning China. But chinoiserie had a different kind of feeling to it. And in fact, it had a playful feel. It was to do, again, with a construct of another culture, but it was rather frivolous, it was rather effeminate, and it wasn't really to be taken seriously. So we have a perfect example of this gaiety, almost, in the Chinese garden by François Boucher in the 1742. So we have our rather decorous ladies enjoying themselves in the garden with parasols and kind of sort of Chinese robes draped around them. But if we actually look at a Chinese image of the Chinese tea garden, it's far more formal. It has very formal aspects of potted plants and the way that they construct their gardens. And this is the nice lady here, and she's having tea brought to her by a little serving boy here. So you can see there is quite a difference between what the Chinese idea of a Chinese garden is and then what the Western idea of a Chinese garden is. And so this goes on. And even the Japanese have depicted Chinese as a kind of chinoiserie playfulness. This Chinese couple in a tea house in Nagasaki are both playing the same flute, but he's also playing her in a very erotic way. So Chinese women were also seen as rather available and rather erotic in the same way that Oriental odalisque ladies were seen to be part of the harem. So rather promiscuous, in other words. So a chinoiserie tapestry by John van der Bank here shows us kind of very quaint and pastoral scenes of peoples inhabiting this rather sort of elegant and fabulous land. And of course the whole notion of China and the Chinese, apart from all the China wares that were coming in through the Dutch East India companies, the British East India, English East India companies that had been trading with China from the 1500s at least, and bringing in China and lacquer and tea and silk and all of that. They still thought of China as being this a kind of rather beautiful place presided over by a benevolent emperor. Well, of course, the reality was not always quite as pretty as that. However, lots of nice ideas were created with chinoiserie, including harpsichord by Pascal Tasquin, beautiful lacquer work on the inside of this here, showing us depicting scenes with gilded scenes on red lacquer. Again, very pastoral, playing music, flowers, birds, all these kinds of things. Or even the teapot, Staffordshire red stoneware, emulating the very refined Yixing biscuitware teapots that they had in China for the scholar class, the scholar official class, here embellished with bamboo and all sorts of Oriental, Chinese, chinoiserie motifs. Not so elegant, but quite attractive in that way. So these kind of scenes became to be used as wallpapers. The original would be silks. The originals would also be hand-painted in China and sent over, and then replicated in our way for our growing Georgian middle classes who had a bit more money to spend and would then like to perhaps use the wall coverings in one of their rooms. Furniture, again, this is all export market wear from China. So, pair of chiffonières, lacquer, inlay, pastoral scenes, interesting genre scenes, beautiful workmanship, I mean, quite extraordinary, and always as a pair for each side of your salon. And very beautifully done. Japanning and lacquer work. Lacquer was often called Japanning because it came from China via Japan, but it was the Chinese, of course, who had invented and were the first to start using lacquer as a covering for wood. Not only wood, leather, all sorts of things, but generally wood, to create these quite wonderful designs. Cantonese export wear include these sconces. It's a bit difficult actually to see where the sconce bit is. In fact, what we have is a very nice porcelain painted with enamels here in the center of a very elegant lady in a Chinese garden with little boys. Now, you often see these images of 100 boys, or there is symbolic of being fertile. And of course, boys were always the favorite. You very rarely see little girls in these pictures. They're always little boys because they were significantly more important. But around this is from Canton, there's quite fabulous parrots and kind of huge flowers, which really don't go at all with this very delicate porcelain in the middle, but they've kind of used the colours and just embellished the whole thing. Here's the sconce bit made in glass for your candle. A sconce, of course, was a wall piece to reflect the light back in, and usually it was mirrored or gilded to throw the light back into the room. So really, again, it's quite over the top, but rather charming. So chinoiserie then was an affectation, and again, it was a term in Western art to do with the exoticism and the kind of frivolity and escapism that one could have with another culture. So it's sort of a decorative style, really, so not so serious. However, that was due to change because of this place. Now, the commonly known Brighton Pavilion was the summer residence of the summer palace, the summer residence of George IV. Who was the Prince Regent originally of George III. George III went a bit strange, so then George IV took over. Now, he loved entertaining. So Brighton was a very insignificant little fishing town on the south coast of England. And there was a kind of farm, quite a large farm, it has to be said, that was in place here, and that got knocked down. And he decided to make his summer palace here. It took in various forms to begin with, but by the 1810s and the 1820s, with a couple of architects, John Nash was the most significant of the architects who decided to create, again, this quite fantastic construct of an Indian palace with Indian minarets and onions and really quite an extraordinary facade. It's actually part of the whole structure. This is an early engraving of it between 1810 and 1820. So it is really, there's nothing else like it actually in England, and certainly wasn't anything like it in Brighton at the time. So it's always been a fairly bold statement. And this also was to do with his summer palace for entertaining and for enjoying his guests. Now, the inside is quite fabulous. So we have an Indian, Oriental, other construct exterior, and the interior is Chinese. So there was, again, this really strange idea of outside and inside, and having this to surprise the guests, of course. I mean, this would have been a huge surprise to them. But one can still visit and one can still see this. So the banqueting hall is one of the finest examples of chinoiserie, but taken to more serious heights, if you like. And it's a vast hall. It can seat hundreds of people for a banquet, and this was where he entertained. But again, every surface. So what Lord Leighton did in miniature in his house in the Arab Hall, George IV made the grand gesture in his palace. So particularly with the banqueting hall. And again, this is from an engraving and a drawing by John Nash, about 1826. In fact, George is here in the middle, entertaining here, and his guests are all around. And you can see some of the details here. These are all hand-painted panels of Chinese ladies, gentlemen, even fishermen, because to keep the fishing connection with the old farm that had been there before, to put that into context in a sense. And again, every surface and every item is quite beautifully done. Now I'm showing you this. It's not a great photograph, but this huge central dome here has this enormous chandelier hanging from it right over the banqueting table. And if we look again at these images, we can see that all this is like shelled. This is gold shells up here. There is a most fabulous large palm tree in the middle and a huge chandelier. And all of these items here, these were lights, all done in enamel and gilding and lacquering and painting. Again, we're thinking of the Ottoman palace when we're looking at this, where every surface is actually covered in something. But these large images of these Oriental and Chinese influences really quite extraordinary. And the dragon, this is hanging above the banqueting table. God help them if it ever fell down. It must weigh a ton. Gilded. So the dragon was the symbol of the exotic in the Far East. You know, Japanese dragons and Chinese dragons were the epitome of exotic culture. And there are lots of dragons on the inside of the Brighton Pavilion, as it's known. So here is this is also called the Long Gallery. It's the main Chinese gallery on the ground floor. And people would stroll up and down here because it was in two different sections. The music hall, as we'll see, is on the other side to the banqueting hall, so people would sit and converse. There were life-sized statues and sculptures of Chinese mandarins here, in fully robed and dressed. There were automata that would entertain people by moving about. There were things hanging. There was a natural light coming in here. Everything was thought about. Here are some of the wall coverings. Everything was thought about. Everything was designed to please you, designed to entertain you. So this was not only to show off your wealth, but it was also to create a leisurely and a relaxed atmosphere. And especially the music room, of course, where they had many, many concerts, is quite extraordinary in its detail. All around here, this is the most fantastic ceiling with these wonderful chandeliers. A great big chandelier in the middle has images from the Chinese opera on it. And all in the cornices, all around this large room, there are dragons, there are drapes, there are curtains, there's gilding, there's lacquering, you name it, it's all there, like some vast tent in effect. So all this was to impress. The upper galleries are quieter in tone. Blue is much more subdued, of course, and it was de rigueur in that way to have a Chinese bedroom. So by the 1750s, the thing about chinoiserie had become known in all the palaces in Europe. So most of them would have had at least one Chinese room or one Chinese wing even to display blue and white china, lacquerware, silks, silk wall coverings, and it was particularly popular to have a Chinese bedroom. This is actually King George IV's bedchamber. So it's quite subdued in a way, but it's very beautiful, very calming to go to sleep. But all the detailing here, these are all silks. I mean, they're very, very beautiful. So this was the height of style in Europe in the 18th century. And it was really George IV who promoted chinoiserie as a serious contender for style. It wasn't just frippery, and it wasn't frivolous. He made the whole of the interior of his palace like this. But the interesting thing was that this was also a residence where he lived. And he wanted this to be a residence for relaxation, where the rules of court did not apply in all senses, which was the complete opposite of Versailles, where the rules of court were strictly observed. So it was as splendid in its way as Versailles, or maybe not quite so much gold and mirrors as Versailles, but the idea was very different. George actually wanted people to relax and enjoy themselves. So this was actually new thinking. It was a much different way of thinking about it. And of course the wall coverings, the silks and the hand-painted wall coverings here, birds and flowers abound in all the rooms. There are yellow rooms, green rooms, blue rooms, pink rooms, red rooms. It's a big palace, and they all had a different color theme, and they all had things to match. And, you know, there's a lot of it. And there were backlit windows with mandarins on them, all sorts of things. So this was quite fantastic. Now, birds and flowers were one of the particular motifs in Chinese painting, which then went through to Japan. So we have a Chinese painting here by Li Qi, birds and flowers, and we have one here by the Kano school in Japan with a gold background. And it was one of the forms of painting. You had landscape painting, you had genre painting, which was not so popular, but you also had birds and flowers, which was a very popular category. So in Japan, and we're now transiting through to Japanese style, which is somewhat different, Ito Jakuchu made lots of albums of the natural world, insects, fish, you name it, he painted it. So we have beautiful albums. This is a whole set of roosters here with all the patterns of all their plumage. And we've got roosters here, birds and flowers and butterflies. beautifully, beautifully painted in all its detail, 17th century. Nijō Castle, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow a little bit more, was the center for the shogunal rule. We're going to talk about that tomorrow because we're kind of moving on, closing time here. But the interior of this Nijō Castle was not where the emperor lived, but where the shogun has his administration. And we can see immediately there is a difference. There is a difference. It is much more lean and spare. There are beautifully painted screens here with gold backgrounds. It was quite lavish, almost coffered ceilings with all kinds of decoration up here, carved transoms up here. So there was a lot of detail going on, but the actual space was rather different. Rather different indeed. Now this is from a classical hand scroll of the tale, the diaries, the illustrated diary of Lady Murasaki in the 10th century. She was a lady in waiting at the imperial court, and she wrote what was to be the first novel in 54 chapters called The Tale of Genji. Genji Monogatari was about Prince Genji and all his life and loves at court. So here she is in the middle of the imperial apartments with beautifully painted green and blue landscapes all around inside. We'll look more at those tomorrow. So these kind of images are lavish and luxurious in their way, but kind of more restrained. Kano Sanraku was from the Kano school of painting. We have many things like this. We have tigers in the bamboo grove, decorative fans which are painted to look like real fans, a bit like trompe-l'oeil, on gold screens in the background. This is gold leafing on the background. So their idea of patterning and detail was quite different to the Chinese style, although this is quite flowing, and also the catch-all phrase of Oriental style, which could be anything from Cairo to the Middle East to Syria to India. I mean, you name it, it was all in that catch-all phrase. So these kind of designs then came into being, into European culture from the 1860s when Japan opened up to the West, and there are reasons for that which we will talk about tomorrow. So we have the props of fans and a Chinese robe here. She's looking at blue and white china. This is Whistler, who was one of the early proponents and early users of Japan and Japan style. And we have all the accessories which are being used in the domestic household for fairly well-to-do middle class, not just the elite, not just the grand palaces. So this was quite a different thing. And when you think about the timing of all this, the Industrial Revolution was in the late 1700s and beyond, and all that production and technology, the production of printing, the production of making wallpapers, the production of making ceramics and pottery grew exponentially during this period. So the peoples who wanted more of this exotic culture got it because of the industrialization and production methods. It meant they could make more blue and white willow pattern, good old Josiah Spode, going to say Wedgwood, no, Spode, brought in this whole idea of availability of this exotic culture. We're going to finish with this one today. I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but James McNeill Whistler has this rather beautiful image of this languorous lady with kimonos looking at Japanese prints. And it's really the Japanese prints that give rise to Japonism. So Japonism, again from the French term, Japon, can be with an E at the end or without. It's up to you. So like chinoiserie, it began as a decorative style in Western art, like here. But it developed into a far-reaching movement that adopted Japanese concepts of space in art. And it became something else. It went into architecture and design, and it created a really modernist style, which came from those concepts of Japanese style, of minimalism, flat color, bold lines, strong patterns. And all those were against the Western rules of Renaissance art. And that's why it was so radical, and that's why it was so different. And it was interpreted in a different way to what had gone before with Orientalism, the other, and Chinoiserie, another, other. But it's all about the Western concept. And as I said, particularly with Orientalism, that kind of concept of viewing the other works both ways, doesn't it? So the Indians have their concept of us, as do the Chinese. So that's the kind of start to bring out these strands. I'm going to stop there, we're about on time, but I also wanted to say and to offer, I have hoped that we might be able to have a visit to the Iziko National Gallery in Cape Town to view their Japanese print collection. It is possible to view. I don't know quite when we can do this. We have to arrange it with the curator. In principle, the curator, Andrea Lewis, has said yes. It's a free service, and we can go. It depends how